Welcome back out on the mushroom trail. It's another beautiful fall day. Mushroom season is certainly in full swing out here. And as I set off into the woods today, I'm really hoping to reconnect with a really special mushroom that I bumped into about a week and a half ago. So I've got my fingers crossed that it's still out here thriving, doing its thing, doing well. Let's jump into this forest. Let's see what we see. And boy, I couldn't be more excited to show you what we've got up here. This is one of the true delicacies or treats of the forest. This is one of my all-time favorite wild edible mushrooms. This is what's commonly referred to as the cauliflower mushroom, Sparassis radicata. This one, you can see kind of where it gets its common name. Some people think that this looks very much like a head of cauliflower. In David Aurora's book, Mushrooms Demystified, he references perhaps a more apt description, and that is a bouquet of egg noodles. So you can see, if I zoom in on this, you can see kind of the way that this thing is structured. So it sort of has that egg noodle, both consistency and shape. So this is actually, sometimes this is described as Sparassis crispa, which is actually misapplied name based on European taxonomy. We don't have that species out here in the Pacific Northwest of the US. We've got the very similar Sparassis radicata, but both of those go by the common name cauliflower mushroom. And this one is actually growing likely along with this Douglas fir here. So this is actually a mushroom that, believe it or not, it's known to have a taproot that can sink way down underground and connect up with the root system of the trees that serve as its host. So this can sometimes, root down as deep as 6 feet where the primordia start to grow. Just imagine that, 6 feet underneath. So, the height of a typical human, right? That's how far this thing will oftentimes reach from its initial kind of primordia that buds or fruits with the roots of these trees. So just fascinating to think about. So we've got a substantial taproot under here, and then we've got several heads of this. So if you notice the appearance, it's just like a whitish color at this stage. As this thing grows and matures and maybe ages or gets a little past prime, it'll take on a more yellowish hue. But again, this is one of the absolute choice edible mushrooms. This is one that it can be very difficult to find because unlike the chanterelles that are, very predictable in terms of their locations that they're going to fruit, from watching previous videos that if you find chanterelles in a single spot any given year, you can very likely return there in the following years and you can find significant fruitings of that same species, and that's because it's ectomycorrhizal, right? This one, yeah, it's working with the roots of Douglas fir, but it's much less predictable, and you will read some literature saying that if you cut this at that taproot and you leave it, you can come back to that same spot and potentially forage this one again next year. But I'll tell you, I've never ever had that experience. So I've found this one several times now, and I've always checked those spots religiously in the years to follow, and I've never, at least to date, come across the cauliflower mushroom in the identical spot as to where I initially found it. So for that reason, this one, it's overall just thought to be a relatively rare mushroom, so it's not one that's frequently found, but it's super desirable. So a lot of times commercial foragers or commercial pickers will really actively seek this out because it'll fetch a very high price for the simple fact that it's rare. It's not one that is found very often, and even though this is one of my absolute favorite edible mushrooms, I'm lucky if I find one or two any given year. So, it's one of those things that, you just happen upon it. It's rarely something that you set out looking for and find, but it's one of those things that you just kind of happen upon. Now, it's worth noting, you can see this is a fairly good size. So, and this thing is a mushroom of substance. So, believe it or not, even though this has a smooth surface, so you'll notice that it doesn't have, any pores or gills, but it's very closely related to the polypores, which a lot of times people are surprised to hear that, but it has quite a bit of heft to it. So, you know, when I cut this out and I kind of throw this into my foraging basket, it's going to have some significant weight to it. And it's not unheard of for people to find clumps or clusters of these that'll sometimes weigh up to, like, say 40 or 50 pounds. So a lot of times when you do find this, you find it in abundance, even though that may be relatively infrequently. It's one of those ones that I've oftentimes shared with friends when I do find it, because sometimes it can be difficult to consume it all at once just because there's so much. Now, all of that said, this is one that dehydrates or dries really, really well, and it has a ton of uses in the kitchen. So a lot of times people will parboil this, or they'll maybe boil it kind of like a noodle. Other times people will marinate it and oven bake it. You can also deep fry it or simmer it. There's all kinds of different preparation methods that people use for this. And it's got a really, really satisfying consistency. So it's got a little bit of a crunch to it. This is one that you generally want to cook fairly well. There's a very small percentage of the population that is allergic to it. So that's something that's good to just kind of know from the get-go. So, you know, if you're trying this for the first time, if you get lucky enough to stumble across this, you're just taking your first sample, as is the case with virtually any wild mushroom that you ever consume. It's recommended to just kind of start slow. Try a small sample, see how your system does with it. And then if, you know, you get no negative reaction and you enjoy the flavor, then you go back for more. But just an incredible delicacy. And again, this is one that, you know, chefs are really eager to get their hands on this. Now, also, aside from being a choice culinary mushroom, it's worth noting that this one is also known to be highly medicinal. So there's quite a bit of research that still needs to be conducted on this, but, you know, it's known to be, so for one thing, it's really good for the skin. So it'll actually encourage collagen production. So it's known as one that people use to treat, you know, say like skin ailments or skin problems. But aside from that, it's also known to be anti-diabetic, anti-cancer, anti-inflammatory, antioxidant. It's even antifungal. So, you know, this is a highly medicinal mushroom that really needs to be studied in greater depth and detail in the years ahead. But again, it's not one that is cultivated here in North America. I've heard stories of, I don't know if it's this exact same species or if it's just a similar cauliflower mushroom that's being cultivated in Japan and sold in markets, but this is not one that, you know, you can just go to the grocery store and pick up here in North America, at least. And, you know, because of the fact that it's relatively rare or infrequent to stumble across this, it's not one that's super well researched or well studied. Now, on top of that, so another thing that's, you know, worth noting is that this particular mushroom is going to grow, so you're not going to find it in a young forest. So notice that the trees that surround us here, look at the furrows in that Douglas fir. This is not a young tree. So this forest that I'm in right now has relatively old growth, and this is a mushroom that you're not going to find in a plantation or something that's, you know, planted with a bunch of young Douglas firs or things. It does grow with coniferous trees, mainly here in the Pacific Northwest. It grows with both Douglas fir and spruce, but not young ones. So this is one of the old growth forests. You might get lucky, you might find it in a secondary growth forest as well. So that's another definite possibility. But, you know, you're not just going to find it stumbling around young trees. So that also makes it increasingly rare for the simple fact that there's not, you know, as much old growth forest as there once was. And the random nature of just kind of where it shows up makes it difficult to predict. So definitely an incredible joy to come across this. Now, one other thing that you may find to be really, really surprising. So I actually first stumbled across this one. It was quite a bit smaller. It was about 10 days ago. And what I did was I actually cut, there was like a middle bouquet or floret that I didn't have a knife with me at the time, so I just pulled that middle kind of fruit body off of this. Now they were all growing from the same base, and I was curious as an experiment just to kind of see how this thing would perform after a portion of the fruit body had been harvested. I may go ahead and throw that footage up here now so that you can kind of see exactly what that looked like when I harvested that younger fruit body. And just up here on the side of the trail, oh boy, am I excited about this one. So check this out. This is just the very initial kind of fruiting or beginning of what's commonly referred to as the cauliflower mushroom, Sparassis radicata. So this is actually a saprobe that is oftentimes referred to as having a parasitic relationship with host trees. Here in the Pacific Northwest, those are conifers. This is going to actually work off of the root system of these conifers. And oddly enough, this can actually grow off of old trunks and standing dead wood, or still living trees where the parasitic nature of it is still not fully understood and it's somewhat up for debate. Let me give this a little tug. Boy, this is one of the best edible mushrooms that you'll find out here. Look at that, just beautiful white flesh. You can see it's got that wavy kind of linguine or egg noodle type structure. As this grows out, a lot of times it will yellow or change in color a little bit. You can see we've got a couple other little florets or heads off to each side. I think that I'm probably gonna leave either one of these, both sides of this, to see what it'll do over the course of the next few days, whether or not it'll fruit out. I'm just gonna tuck this in here, give it a good spot. I'm super excited to get this home. This is one of my absolute favorite wild edible mushrooms. This is edible and choice. Can't wait to get this home and cook with it. Haven't had this for nearly a year. So exciting find out here. That's the cauliflower mushroom. Now here's the crazy thing. Because this is so rare out here, and because I find it so infrequently, and because it's also one of my absolute favorites, I was a little bit reluctant to just harvest a portion of that and leave the rest behind. But I was also at the same time very, very curious to kind of track its growth and to see how it would do. And as I referenced earlier, this thing oftentimes grows to just immense or massive proportions. So I had a sneaking suspicion that if I left it here, it would do exactly what it's done, and it would continue to kind of grow and to fruit out. So what I did is I actually placed a fern over it just to make it a little less conspicuous, for the simple fact that this is directly on a trail. It's not necessarily a well-traveled trail, but it was fairly obvious to me. So I was kind of curious, and to be totally honest, I was planning on getting back here a lot earlier than I did. So it ended up being about a week and a half, which was longer than I had hoped. But I think that was a good thing, because when I do go to harvest this one today, I'm gonna get a lot more than I otherwise would. So very cool to see. Again, this is the cauliflower mushroom, Sparassis radicata, and it's worth noting that that radicata portion of the Latin name refers to rooted. So, that's one of the key features of this thing, is that taproot goes down and really is an incredible feature that's unique to this mushroom. Now, in that same breath, it's worth noting that there really aren't mushrooms that I'm aware of that look anything similar to this, at least not that I would describe as looking similar to this. So for that reason, if you happen upon this, it's a relatively easy one to identify. And so I would encourage you all just to kind of keep an eye out for this one, especially if you're perusing kind of older growth or old secondary growth forests here in the Pacific Northwest. This is an absolutely incredible find. And you can see that there's a lot there. I can't wait to get this home and to clean it off and prepare it and add it to tonight's meal. So I just wanted to share that with y'all. Beautiful, beautiful mushroom. So I just wanted to take a quick second to really focus in on the details and the structure of what this fruiting body really looks like. So again, this is really, really unique. I can't think of anything that looks quite like this out here. This is gonna have this really thin, kind of crisp to rubbery flesh that you can see a lot of people compare it to cauliflower. Some people think it looks a lot like a brain, right? But it's got this really unique kind of signature stature. And if we zoom in and we look closely at the outer margin, notice how it's got this kind of ruffled, lobed outer margin. Again, quite unique, and you can see, you know, that real distinct feature. Really let this settle in, because if you bump into this out in the forest, you really, I would recommend harvesting it and bringing it back. It's really a special one, and again, relatively simple to identify. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna actually cut this at the base. Again, I'm super curious to see if in fact I can have the pleasure of being able to come back to this exact spot in future years. Again, that hasn't worked out for me yet, but I'm certainly up for trying. So notice too, now that I've cut this, you can look in here and you can see this thing is really great at kind of hiding little duff and needles and stuff. So sometimes it can be a bit of a chore cleaning this out. Of course, what I'm going to try to do is field dress it as much as possible, so kind of get off the very obvious debris and things. But then once I get it home, I'm going to actually soak this in some water, or just kind of swish it around in a bowl of salt water to just kind of free up any other little debris that may be there. So check this out so you can see up here just how significant or substantial this root base is. I mean, it's just huge. In this part, I cut through most of it. Take that off. So you can see that this taproot is just massive, and it goes far, far down underneath. I'm gonna actually take this one as well, this head over here, and then we'll leave the bulk of the actual body that's connected to the taproot. We'll leave that intact, but boy, look at this underneath. Isn't that just beautiful? This is gonna be absolutely delicious. This has got quite a bit of heft to it, and you can see that if I was aggressively going for this, I might, you know, actually harvest this as well, because this is a lot of weight. But again, I'm more interested in kind of seeing if this thing will continue to fruit and do its thing. So this is something that I'll check back on periodically, more as just an experiment. I'll probably cover this up with a little bit of duff. This is where I kind of filled in where I originally made my tear right here, and then this stuff continued to fruit out. So very interesting to see. And look at that, this almost has like sort of a banded, almost agate look to it, and you can see quite a bit of moisture in it just from the recent rains and from its growth cycle. But interesting to see this banding around that kind of core, that base. Really cool to see. So take a close-up look. Here's that taproot, or what's left after I kind of cut it away. So you can see one of those bouquets was over here. A couple were over here that I just took. And then right here in the center is that initial bit that I pulled out a week and a half ago. So will this thing continue to fruit out from these other little pieces in the days to come? We'll have to see. You know, it's something that I'm really curious to kind of follow up on and to see. So for now, I think I'm just gonna sort of fill this in, put a little moss over it, give it a little bit of protection, and then check back in a couple weeks and see. And there may or may not be anything, and same thing I suppose goes for next year. There may or may not be anything, but you can bet that I'm gonna remember this spot, and that I'll certainly be back to kind of see what we see out here. So awesome to see again, probably one of my absolute favorite mushrooms to encounter out here. Feel so lucky to have stumbled across this year, and hope you all encounter one of these this season too. This is shaping up to be the best mushroom season that I can remember, so who knows what else will come in the days to follow, but hopefully it continues well into October and November. And who knows as well, maybe this will be the first of many cauliflower mushrooms this year. I suppose it's possible. So keep your eyes peeled out there, and until next time, happy trails.